Sermon this week, as we flow into small groups, is dealing with the 100th Psalm. Now, it's a really famous psalm that a lot of people know, and I wanted to take a couple minutes and look at the last phrase in the last verse. And that last phrase says, "And His faithfulness continues to each generation." Now, that final phrase is a promise, and it's a promise to us. When you look in Scripture, you have to always look at who a promise is given to. I think sometimes we like to take maybe a promise that's given to a specific individual or to a specific group of people and try to bring that out of context and give it to everybody. And that's not always appropriate. In Scripture, one of the main things we have to stop and focus on is what is the context that these things are being seen in. Who is God talking to? Who is the author? What is happening around those words that God may speak or that a prophet may speak for the Lord. But this one really, to me, goes down through all generations right down to us. So He's telling us there that He's faithful to each generation. Now, God's truth and God's faithfulness spring from something very important. That's His unchanging nature. Like, people change. Okay, we morph, we transition. I look at myself, 10 years ago. I look at myself 20 years ago. I'm a vastly different person. The way I talk about things, the way I think about things, what I feel is important in life. All of those things change, and they change a lot of times just because my circumstances change. When I was 20 years ago, I'm 23 years old. I'm just coming out of college. I'm not married. The things that I thought were important were a lot different. I love the Lord. I was serving Him. I was on staff at a church. But, my personal kind of thoughts and my personal preferences and things were different, And it's so different now when I think about having, Charlie and Marie and the responsibilities that I have and leading a church and those things. That I just didn't have them. So I change. We all change. You've changed. But God doesn't change. See, that's incredible to me. He has this unchanging nature. So when He says He is going to be faithful to each generation, there's no changing that. His truth and His faithfulness spring from that unchanging nature that He has. So God's promises to us, the way God deals with us, God's love for us, God's thought process, what God thinks is important, never changes. It's simply continuing along from generation to generation. So He's true and telling truth, and He's unchanging when He's dealing with His creation. He's true, He's unchanging, He's faithful when He's dealing with humanity. And He's true and faithful in every single one of His promises. See, that's incredibly important for us to think about. Because, see, there's no mistakes with God. Humans, we make mistakes. We foul things up. But God is omniscient and omnipotent and all-knowing and all-loving and all-powerful. He's all those things. So there's no mistakes with Him. I may look at my life, and there's been moments where I'm like, God, are you sure about this? What are you doing? I think you may have made a mistake, but that's simply not true. You may look around your life and say, everything in my life right now is moving against me. That's not what's happening. You may not see what God is doing, but I promise you God is working, because He tells us right there in Psalm 100 that He is faithful, and His faithfulness continues across generations. So that phrase literally means from generation to generation. Now, generations come and go, right? I mean, we sit here at church, and the honest truth is we are standing on the shoulders of the generations that came before us. Our country is standing on the shoulders of generations come before us. Our families, we're standing on the shoulders of the generations that's come before us. So the same thing is happening with the Lord. He is here and He remains forever. Those generations may pass away, but God is unchanging. God is right there in front of us from generation to generation. Now here's the thing. God is faithful through these generations, but are we? The Bible gives us a really great example of this, flowing from the books of Joshua into the book of Judges, okay? From Joshua to Judges. The generation that Joshua led, like across the Jericho River and around Jericho, and leading them as they marched, and then they blew those trumpets and down came the walls, right? Around Jericho. That generation was faithful. They followed the Lord. Do they have some issues here and there where there's some troublemakers? You bet. But overall, that generation followed God. Then you flow over to the book of Judges, and what you find really quickly is that generation did not. As Joshua and his generation stepped off the stage, they gave them some very specific commandments, some very specific things that this next generation was continuing to do. Didn't do any of them. And so what you find in the book of Judges is the nation of Israel is a mess. They're a wreck as they deal through all of the things that happen over the course of about 400 years in the book of Judges. It's a mess. So when I think about this, God doesn't change, but we do. So let me ask you today, how are you helping to pass on the truth of God's faithfulness and His love to us across generations to the next generation within our church or within your family, to your children, to your grandchildren, maybe to little brothers and sisters? Maybe you don't have any kids yet, but how are you trying to do this through our student ministry, through our children's ministry? Because worshiping God and following Him does not simply happen by accident. I look back across the generations in my family. I look back to my great-grandmother, okay, who worshiped at First Baptist Church of Ashland, Alabama, the church that I actually grew up in. She lived there. She grew there. Then she passes that on to my grandmother, who passes it on to my mom, who passes it on to me. And so I'm sitting as a boy growing up worshiping in the same exact church as my great-grandmother. That's passed down to me. And it didn't happen by accident. My parents taught me to love the Lord, taught me to pray. My grandfather, my grandmother, I witnessed the faithfulness that they had for God, that they had for the church. None of that was happening by accident. And I promise you this, it won't happen by accident in your family either. Kids don't pick up their faith and grow in their walk with Christ or become saved just by accident. They just happen to, fall over and stub their toe one day and next thing you know, they know Christ. That's not how it works. The best thing to have happen is for it to be passed down through that family. So how are you doing that? How are you doing that with the young people that are a part of your family in passing down from generation to generation about the faithfulness of God and the worship and faithfulness to God? Because see, you also pass on generational sins. David and Solomon are a great example of this. David married and had a bunch of concubines. He married a bunch of women, had a bunch of concubines. So Solomon grows up and Solomon sees this. So what did Solomon do? Solomon goes behind David and he marries more women and has even more concubines. See, that's something that David passed on to his son that was not positive. That polygamy was awful. It hurt David in his relationship with the Lord, and it hurt Solomon in his relationship to the Lord. So just as you can pass on from generation to generation and talk about the faithfulness and the trustworthiness of God and what it means to worship and serve Him, you can also pass on those generational sins. I've watched it. I've watched families pass on those things, to pass on those good things and those bad things. Families deal with this. I will watch a son mimic what his father does. And that can be a good thing or it can be an awful thing. I watch it happen in broken families. I watch it happen with alcohol. I watch it happen with drugs. I watch it happen with unfaithfulness. I watch it happen over and over through the years, being a youth pastor and then turning around and watching those people grow up, get married, and have kids themselves and see the patterns that are forming there. So as I think about this, as the years roll by, I find myself realizing how much of my life is now wrapped up in this little 5-year-old girl that lives at my house. And today she's 5. Tomorrow she'll graduate high school. The day after that she's going to have kids. And pretty soon I'll be dead and gone and she'll be a grandmother. That's how this works. That's what's happening. So what I'm passing on to her about God is one of the absolute most important things I can do. Me teaching her how God is faithful from generation to generation, I'm passing on to her something that really matters. I'm giving her something that then she can pass on to her children and to her grandchildren, maybe even to her great-grandchildren. I saw it happening across the generations in my family, and I want to see that continue. But that means I've got to make sure I'm doing that. I have to be intentional about that. Our church has to be intentional about that. Our individual families have to be intentional about that. And here's the truth. We can't rely on the church to do this all by themselves. The church supports what the family is doing, but we're only one little piece. It's what's happening within the 4 walls of that home is what is really determining passing these things on from generation to generation, because God is going to be faithful. But the question becomes, will we be faithful? Hope you guys have a great small group this week.